November 8, 1993. A pair of frightening occurrences on different continents on October 26 resulted in the death of Mexican wrestler Oro and a vicious hotel street fight in England between Sid Vicious, Sid Vicious, and Arnold Anderson. Marty Lunda resulted in both men receiving numerous stab wounds. Not only are Vicious and Anderson's future in World Championship Wrestling in question at press time, but WCW management faces some major scrutiny because of rumors of hypocritical and double-standard decisions that many believe could have set the tone for the incident. As of press time, WCW officials have only responded to questions regarding the futures of both wrestlers with comments that the incident is under investigation, and have avoided answering several serious questions the incident raised regarding the company's drug testing policy and booking and contract decisions that have been made in recent weeks by a company desperately pretending to ignore the obvious. The Vicious-Anderson brawl took place at approximately 2 a.m. the evening of the 26th at the Moat House Hotel in Blackburn, Lancashire, England. The two were part of the WCW troupe that began touring Europe, with its first show having taken place hours earlier in Cardiff, Wales. After a lengthy plane ride to England, followed by a show and a 3-hour bus ride to the hotel in Blackburn, trouble started between the two at the hotel bar. According to numerous reports, most of which were, with the exception of minor details, remarkably similar, the first stages of trouble started when Vicious started bragging about how he just held the company up for a major contract raise, reportedly up to $600,000 per year, to agree to do the job for Sting at the Halloween Havoc pay-per-view show a few days earlier. Both men had been drinking and Vicious was apparently ribbing Anderson over the fact that he had just received a $100,000 per year raise, while Anderson had received a $100,000 pay cut. Under Bill Watts, Anderson's 1992 contract of $250,000 per year was cut to a 1993 deal of $750 per night deal, which should result in roughly a $100,000 pay cut. Vicious was reportedly bragging about how the company was going to be built around him and it was time for Sting to step out of the spotlight as the company's main character, apparently taking the franchise angle from the pay-per-view match seriously, and said that it was time for Anderson and the other old man, in reference to Ric Flair, to retire so the company could start being successful. Those close to Vicious confirm a similar argument story, with Vicious claiming Flair was repetitive and washed up and should retire for the good of the company, and Anderson defending his friend. Anderson responded something to the effect that Vicious couldn't work and had never proven to be able to draw money. Anderson got in Vicious' face and perhaps some of the guys were egging them on. At one point Anderson challenged Vicious to step outside and Vicious backed down, but at about that point, WCW security chief Doug Dillinger separated the two and ordered both to go to their hotel rooms and cool off. Anderson was taken back to his room by Dillinger, and Vicious, who trailed behind, went back to his. Just before Anderson shut the door, the two had words again as Dillinger threw Anderson in his room and locked the door. Sometime shortly thereafter, Vicious came down to Anderson's room and brought a broken-off piece of either a chair or table from his hotel room with him. Stories get dissimilar at this point. The version attributed to Anderson is that someone tried to kick down his door and the kicks were so powerful the door was practically coming off its hinges. As he looked through the peephole, he saw nothing and the kicks stopped. He opened the door and nobody was there. As he stuck his head out the door, he was blindsided with a baseball bat swing-like blow from the weapon and knocked out. The other version was that Vicious asked Anderson to talk things out because they had a long tour ahead of them, and Anderson responded he was going to cut him up and chased him with scissors, and Vicious was defending himself with the chair shot. At this point Vicious allegedly jumped on him and the two started brawling. Anderson reportedly told friends that the first blow with the weapon knocked him out for a few minutes, and when he started regaining his senses, Vicious was on top of him beating his face into oblivion. Somehow Anderson got loose and grabbed a pair of scissors with a dull tip rather than a spike-like tip and stabbed Vicious in the stomach with them, opening him up. At this point Vicious retreated and went into the hall, where Anderson jumped on him again. Vicious was stabbed with the scissors at least 3 more times, with most reports saying they were in the stomach but those close to Vicious saying 2 shots were in the face and 1 in the hand. Vicious somehow got the scissors away, with reports ranging from Anderson dropping them while wrestling with him in the hotel hallway and Vicious picking them up, to Vicious punching Anderson in the eye and grabbing them from the ground. At any rate, Vicious allegedly began stabbing Anderson over and over, with Anderson receiving a total of 20 stab wounds, most in the shoulders and back but at least one that was 1 inch below his eye that there is belief was aimed at the eye. Wrestlers are always taught in street fight situations to go for the eye, and another in the throat and was covered in blood from head to toe by the time Too Cold Scorpio heard the struggle and broke things up, which may have saved Anderson's life. Vicious apparently claimed to have blacked out and not remembered anything other than regaining his senses while on top of a bloody Anderson. Most of the gashes were about 1/2 inch deep. but the gash in the throat was 5 inches long. By the time separate ambulances arrived, they found Vicious waiting in a reception area and Anderson in bad shape in his hotel room. At some point in the struggle, a hotel window was shattered as well, because the hotel hall the next morning was covered with both men's blood, broken glass. Police and newspaper reporters and reportedly WCW had to make major amends to the hotel to settle the situation. Both men were rushed to the nearby Blackburn Royal Infirmary Hospital. Vicious, whose eye reportedly was swollen up like a tennis ball, had exploratory surgery done on Wednesday and was released from the hospital and returned home by the end of the week. Anderson, who was weakened by losing approximately 1.5 pints of blood, and whose eye was totally swollen shut, was also released from the hospital and returned home by the weekend but was still in a very weakened state a week later. Doctors reportedly told Anderson that if he had lost much more blood that the damage could have been life-threatening, that if the scissors had a sharp edge that it is questionable if he could have survived the attack, and if the gash near the eye was an inch in another direction he'd have lost the eye. Initially both men filed complaints against one another but withdrew their complaints largely because they would have had to remain in the country for 90 days to get the complaints prosecuted on, and the police didn't file charges likely because both were immediately going to leave the country. Although the story received banner headlines in both London and Lancashire, England tabloids, because of the manner of which the stories were written and the reputation of pro wrestling in the country, reports are that most British wrestling fans simply felt it was an angle to hype ticket sales for a disappointing tour. Reuters news service sent the story on its international wire, although it received only minimal coverage in the US, and a little more in Canada, including a brief item in Thursday's USA Today. Most of the North American reports noted both men as being stabbed, although gave the indication it wasn't the result of a fight between the two but from outside parties, and listed both men as WWF wrestlers, as did most of the British radio and television media when covering the story. WCW PR head Mike Weber, who was on tour in England, tried to use the fight as a means of hyping pro wrestling as real, with his quote in the London Sun saying, "It just shows that what you see in the ring is what you see in real life. These two haven't fought each other for several years and obviously don't get along. I don't know what the disagreement was about. Actually, according to those close to the situation, while the two were not friends, they were co-workers on and off for many years and not enemies prior to this incident." Vicious attempted to call Anderson on Monday to apologize. On the WCW hotline this week and on its television shows over the weekend, there was no acknowledgement of any incident having taken place except by Missy Hyatt. Hyatt talked of the incident on Sunday on the hotline, placing the blame on Vicious and saying that he was fired because of it, which may have been jumping the gun because the company has officially not made any announcement of such. As of our latest reports, Vicious was going to see a doctor early in the week to determine how long it would be before he physically would be able to return to the ring, if he still had a place to work. The estimates as to when Anderson would be able to return were between 1 and 2 months, but there was no word on his employment status, although it is now believed he'll be retained. By Thursday, WCW officials gave word to the production staff to remove Vicious and Anderson from all pre-taped television shows that would begin airing this coming weekend, which led to widespread belief within the production and announcing crew of the company that both had been or were going to be fired. Reportedly, all promotion for the Starrcade pay-per-view show where Vicious was initially scheduled to win the WCW title from Vader has been changed to pushing Vader defending against Flair as the main event. That was actually the second choice as steps were taken to put together a different main event bringing in a wrestler from outside whose name can't be confirmed, but that deal quickly fell apart. The decision was made that it was too late to re-edit the TBS shows over Halloween weekend, one of which included a heavily pushed Vicious vs. Ric Flair match to determine who would meet Vader at the November 10th Clash, Flair winning on DQ leading to Vicious' babyface turn. Both men had been prominently featured on TBS Saturday night shows taped through the end of November. On the November 6th show, Vicious was the person being interviewed when Gene Okerlund makes his WCW debut. On November 13th, Anderson and Paul Roma were in a key television match against Paul Orndorff and Yoshi Kwan. On November 20th, the television main event was Vader and Steve Austin scheduled against Flair and Vicious, where the Kongs destroy Vicious before the match and, ironically, Anderson replaces him in a 30-minute match which ends with Vicious doing a run-in to save Flair and Anderson. At some point in November, an angle was scheduled to be shot where Roma would turn heel on Anderson, leading to a Starrcade match on December 27th in Charlotte. It is well known the original plan was for Vicious to win the WCW title from Vader at the same card, then win the other world title from Rick Rude in early 1993 to finally unify the belts, and pushed as the focal point of the company. And therein lies a problem that WCW management at press time is desperately avoiding addressing, and the crux of the problem the WWF has spent years trying to circumvent. Steroids. Lies about steroids. Steroid tests. Hypocrisy about steroids. More lies about steroids. Double standards when it comes to steroids. Lies about steroid tests. For years it has almost become a subject of weekly discussion within these pages. And it has all come to a head once again between this incident, a front-page article on October 30th in the Long Island daily newspaper Newsday on the WWF, Vince McMahon, the federal investigation, and the Zahor Ian trial that went on the national wires, and a spoof on the subject that evening on NBC's Saturday Night Live. It's a story that will never go away because of wrestling management that can never address it or deal with it in an honest manner, and promoters who can't resist the temptations of pushing freakishly muscular individuals because of the belief, founded in some cases and not in others, that they are what the public wants to see and thus going to draw them money. These promoters either figure they can either fool the public, or perhaps delude themselves that said wrestlers aren't using artificial physique enhancers when deep down they can't be so blind as not to know, and hide behind the words we test when the inevitable heat comes down. The term roid rage has been used endlessly in the past week by wrestlers and other officials within wrestling and those following wrestling in reference to the Sid Vicious brawl. The medical profession can debate itself endlessly over whether it's even a viable term. There are many people in this world who have used steroids, and only a minute percentage have ever had any behavior of this manner, although many on steroids have claimed while on the drugs their tempers shorten. The vast majority of wrestlers have used steroids at one time or another in their lives, and incidents of this type virtually never happen, so pointing the finger of blame at steroids, while it might be as a defense used in court if this case happened in the United States, doesn't seem to be in and of itself a valid explanation. If the term is viable, there is always the question as if it's applicable in this case. Either way, enough people are calling this a classic example of roid rage, maybe even multiplied by the effects of alcohol, despite no concrete evidence except visual of any steroid use. If that term is correct, the fingers all point straight at WCW management. If that term isn't, the fingers of questions still have to point in that same direction. Some people are going to read this as an indictment of Sid Vicious. While that conclusion-based what happened is justified, the real crux of this problem is not Sid Vicious at all. It is the environment that created Sid Vicious. If this reads like a liberal viewpoint that blames society for criminal actions, it is not. It is a realistic viewpoint that blames management of both major promotions in the United States for creating a double standard of on one hand professing to be anti-steroid / illegal physique enhancing drugs, and on the other hand rewarding past, and perhaps present, users with the biggest pushes, the title belts, and most importantly, both preferential treatment and the most money, trying to hide behind the words we test as a defense mechanism to avoid blame and liability, despite numerous people in key positions who readily, anonymously, admit what reality is. It is a system that has continued through a federal trial, much negative media publicity, and through a nearly 2-year-long federal investigation. And it is a hypocritical system which few have thrived in, and perhaps none have made a mockery of more than Sid Vicious. If it wasn't for the fact that he's almost universally disliked by those within his profession, he would deserve much commendation from wrestlers and the wrestling press as the man who is the proof of what everyone assumes all along but can't prove tangibly, that those who use the magic words we test the most are the biggest hypocrites and provably do have a double standard. Sid Vicious, in all his muscular glory, signed a $250,000 per year deal with World Championship Wrestling in 1989, based on anything but his wrestling ability and almost exclusively based on his size and muscularity. A few months into that deal, he suffered a collapsed lung, which most attribute to taking a bad bump in a match against the Steiners. He continued to receive his $5,000 per week while recuperating, as well he should have despite claims of others, because the injury was suffered on the job. Several months later, WCW was running a string of major house shows, and even though Vicious hadn't been cleared for wrestling, they wanted him to be in the corner as a second, so at least whatever name value he had could be used to sell tickets. Sid Vicious was advertised on about a month's worth of house shows as being in the corner of various Hill main eventers, but Sid Vicious missed the entire run. The story from WCW management privately was that he missed the shows because he stayed home to play softball. Was Sid Vicious suspended without pay for his no-shows? Was he fired because they believed he stayed home to play softball rather than go to work, even though his appearances were booked, so he was being kept out of physical contact because he hadn't recovered from his injury? No. Eventually he came back to the ring, was pushed like crazy, got over, and stunk up main event matches because while his look was an A+ at the time, his ability was still a D. He still was pushed to the top, and was even rewarded with a $25,000 bonus for holding the company up before doing a job with one of the world's most screwed-up finishes ever to Sting on the 1990 Halloween Havoc pay-per-view show. Was it his fault for holding out for a bonus to do a job, even though most other wrestlers do them as an everyday thing? No. The same rules that apply to mere wrestlers don't apply to Sid Vicious. Is that saying Sid's ego was out of control? No. Management once again gave him the bonus. Sid was right. The same rules didn't apply. Most wrestlers, as Scott Norton and many others have found out, would be given the heave-ho pronto for trying to stunt like that. Sid Vicious received a bonus. About a year later, with about 1 year remaining on his contract, Vicious held out for more money. At the time he had gotten an offer from Vince McMahon and believed he'd be the next Hulk Hogan and believed he was promised the WrestleMania 1992 main event. Despite being offered a huge raise by Jim Herd, and at one point accepting the deal, he decided to jump a valid contract to join the WWF. In between these two things there was a minor item of a loser gets carried out on a stretcher match on a pay-per-view with El Gigante, now Giant Gonzalez. In putting on a performance that epitomized the term not showing up to work, Vicious did the job, got right back up, and walked back to the dressing room leaving the stretcher job for someone else. Was that his fault? No. Management booked someone else to do his stretcher job for him even though it was his final appearance with the company. They didn't force him to do it, or even hold his release up unless he agreed to. The same management then gave him his release on a valid contract to work for the opposition, despite instances when the situation was reversed and the opposition was hardly so obliging. So Sid Vicious learned that a valid contract means nothing, pre-booked match stipulations don't apply to him, and he could do basically whatever he wanted and not suffer the same consequences as would face virtually all others. Soon after came the Zahor Ian trial, Arsenio Hall, and the announcement of the world's first unbeatable steroid test by the WWF, a test later exposed by its own second doctor in charge as being precisely the same beatable testing every other sports organization was doing at the time. Vicious was immediately pushed to the moon by the WWF in spite of its public anti-drug stance, and why shouldn't they have? Sid had still never failed a steroid test, so how could anyone have had a clue he had ever used the stuff? By the time the testing started, Sid was on the sidelines with a torn bicep. So during the exact same period that Vince McMahon was on Larry King proclaiming that nobody in the WWF was using steroids, bragging about unbeatable drug tests, and taking issue with people who claimed his organization promoted use, here was Sid Vicious, still devoid of wrestling ability, being pushed for the main event at WrestleMania. There was a little matter of steroid testing to get around. There have been many stories that Sid wasn't the only one using Visine bottles, or sleight of hand, or whatever it was that was done to substitute someone else's urine, but at one point just 1 week before WrestleMania, he was caught. WWF steroid policy specifically states cheating on a test is an automatic positive, 6 weeks suspension. Wasn't it ironic that this took place just days before Dr. Mauro Di Pasquale, North America's leading expert on how to circumvent steroid tests, well known by world-class powerlifters as the man to call for advice on beating that sports test, was announced at a seminar as the new man to administer the new greatest most comprehensive and second first unbeatable testing program. Dr. D, in an interview with me on March 25, just days before Mania, talked of how serious both he and McMahon were about testing and that if a headliner tested positive right before a pay-per-view and wasn't suspended, how he'd quit the program. Luckily the incident with Sid took place 3 days too early for Dr. D to find out what McMahon would have done. In McMahon's defense, there is no question he was serious about getting rid of steroids because of the PR, not to mention legal problem, but he couldn't resist the temptation of still pushing the muscular body types and using drug test as his defense when it came to a guy who looked like Sid Vicious. But when push came to shove before WrestleMania, there was no suspension when it would have meant changing a pay-per-view main event. There would have been hell to pay with all the publicity out, and few believe any wrestling promoter in the world would have suspended someone in the same position. The problem was that after WrestleMania, there was still no suspension. After a European tour, with Sid main eventing every night, they opened the new US post-Mania season and within a few days, Sid walked out. Then he was suspended. After having to sit out for nearly 1 full year because McMahon wasn't as generous as Jim Herd about releasing someone with a valid contract to work for his opposition, Sid Vicious, as big as ever, returned to WCW for yet another big money deal and huge promises of a push to the top. A few months back, after one WCW wrestler after another was being brought in by federal agents in investigating steroid use within Titan Sports during the period those same wrestlers worked there, an organization that largely, although despite claims to the contrary, not entirely, had rid itself of steroid use, WCW had become the new haven for certain wayward steroid users. This was despite a verbal anti-steroid stance by management going back to January 1992 when Kip Fry authored the most unique steroid policy in sports, that was released with major hullabaloo and quickly ignored when Fry was replaced by another vocal anti-steroid hypocrite named Bill Watts. Wrestlers within the company estimated use at 50 to 70%. 50% was probably closer to accurate at the time, nowhere near the level wrestlers had claimed Titan was at its peak, but certainly significant since the use was strongest at the top of the cards and there was no semantic questions of the drug's legality in any form or fashion by this time, or that a wrestling company was flirting with disaster in continuing to ignore the issue. It was already proven fact that a company could take a major hit from a steroid scandal, not to mention potential serious legal ramifications as well, as anyone with 2 ears and eyes in the business should have been well aware of. So one day an announcement was made about yet another new steroid policy, released to the wrestlers in a lengthy memo, saying that all wrestlers signing new contracts had to be tested and pass the test before they could receive their new deal, and that there would be both regular testing of everyone, and also more extensive testing of those displaying symptoms that would be suspicious. Now, whose photo is in the encyclopedia when they talk about those displaying symptoms? Right about the same time, WCW held a tryout to bring in new talent in Florida. When wrestlers like Thunder and Lightning pass the tryout and are brought in, and someone the caliber of Jimmy Richland, SMW's Jimmy Del Rey, is turned down, it makes yet another mockery out of those pronouncements. Eventually, after being told ahead of time, all WCW wrestlers were supposed to go in one afternoon before a taping to be steroid tested. The results or lack thereof of such have turned into only the latest in a long series of laughingstocks when it comes to the subject, since either failure didn't result in suspension as the existing policy stated, or nobody failed, which even the thought of was preposterous even given the beatable nature of tests and lackluster monitoring of them. The one thing we know for sure is that Sid Vicious didn't fail that test. He missed the test. He had a valid reason. The company booked him for a public appearance the day before and he couldn't get back in time. Eventually, according to several reports, he was asked to take the test at a television taping a few weeks later and walked out. By company policy, that would mean an automatic 6-week suspension and no reinstatement until he was able to pass a new test. The next day, everything was smoothed out. It is the belief of many wrestlers, but unable to be confirmed at press time, that Vicious never took the test, and may have even refused again on a later occasion or even on 2 later occasions. A statement TBS and WCW management had refused comment on despite several media requests early this week in the wake of the latest incident. If this is true, and if is the key word because nothing is confirmed, then here is the crux of this entire situation. How can a company give a huge raise and make the decision to make someone world champion and build the company around someone with a track record like this? Easy, because of how the man looks. Rules that apply to most wrestlers don't apply to someone who is 6'8", 300 pounds with little body fat and freakish muscularity, even though people who look like that are the exact reason wrestling companies have been pressured into making those rules to begin with. If Sid Vicious walked out on a test and wasn't suspended right then and there, the management of WCW needs to answer the question as to why its written policy wasn't enforced. If Sid Vicious did this more than once and wasn't fired after the second occurrence, more questions need to be answered, and those who let him slide need to be called on the carpet and severely reprimanded for creating the double standard. If those officials didn't immediately follow up by insisting on changing the planned storyline of Sid Vicious becoming the next world champion at that point, there is strong question as to whether they should be allowed to continue in their positions. If he did this a third time, those who allowed it and continued to allow the storylines to go unchecked in the direction of making him world champion, while possessing knowledge of this, need to be fired, not to mention the legal liability they should have to answer for because of the end result of all this. If he walked out on a steroid test and was subsequently given a raise, or a bonus to do a job, or however it is worded, the people responsible for making the decisions to give him that raise and still give him the world title should be fired along with, if not ahead of, Sid Vicious. Even if steroids are not applicable to this story and none of the items regarding walking out on tests are true, there is still no way WCW can justify Sid Vicious remaining part of the company. Oro, the wrestler being groomed to be the future top star of the EMLL promotion, passed away during a match on October 26 at Arena Coliseo in Mexico City. He was 2 months shy of his 22nd birthday. Oro's real name was unknown at press time, although he is the son of former wrestler Calavera II and brother of EMLL wrestler Plata, not to be confused with EMNLL wrestlers Brazo de Oro and CMLL World Heavyweight Champion Brazo de Plata. Because of Oro's daredevil tactics, second in the world to Triple A's Rey Mysterio Jr. in degree of dangerous and innovative flying moves, and said to be comparable to only La Fiera in his youth as being willing to do spectacular topes with his foe moving and being willing to crash onto the floor for finishes when he was scheduled to lose a match. The idea that he would wind up with a serious injury from wrestling would not have been a surprise. At 5'10" and 195 pounds, he was much larger than Mysterio Jr., which is why it was felt his potential was such that he was ultimately going to be EMLL's top native star within a few years. He was taken out of his trio of Los Metallicos in the past year in order to groom him as an individual. Ironically, his death came after a simple chop during the six-man tag team semi-main event pitting himself, La Fiera and Brasso de Plata against Dr. Wagner Jr. and Caos I and Jacques Mate. The match aired on the EMLL's television show in Mexico City on Sunday. In the first fall, Caos chopped Oro, who apparently tried to take what was described as the Kina Kobashi bump, in reference to the two back suplexes Kobashi took in a recent match with Steve Williams that it looked to be a miracle didn't break his neck, spinning and landing on his head from the chop. Caos tried to pick Oro up for the next spot, but he was already limp. He collapsed in the corner and his pulse got low and he was screaming to take his boots and ring outfit off, and for the wrestlers to not let him lapse into a coma. It is a long-standing Mexican tradition because there have probably been more deaths in the ring there than anywhere else that you can't die when you are conscious, and those fearful always scream at the others in the ring to slap them around to keep them from going out. Eventually he was stretchered out early in the second fall, but by the time he was in the ambulance to be taken to the hospital, he was already dead. The incident reminded many of an incident in the same building on December 25, 1979, when 23-year-old Sangre India missed a dangerous tope, suffered a broken back, went into shock, and died in front of the fans. No autopsy was performed on Oro at the family's request, however those in Mexico claimed he never used drugs and was in perfect health. It is believed he died of a brain aneurysm. Oro was the kind of wrestler who insisted on doing at least one high-risk move in every match and was very competitive with his flying moves. If someone did a spectacular move lower on the card, Oro felt it was his duty, being a young wrestler higher on the card, to top the move. Because of the death, there has been a clamor for doctors to be more cautious when wrestlers take major bumps or seem to be in a bad way. A lot of fans have freaked out in recent days when certain wrestlers have taken big bumps or collapsed out of the ring, including a few days later a lot of women crying hysterically when Vampiro collapsed on the floor after a match with Black Magic at Arena Mexico. Even the rival AAA on its television show taped 3 nights later had a 3-minute tribute to Oro with many fans in tears. Oro, which translated into English simply means gold, was born December 24, 1971 in Guadalajara. He debuted 1 month before his 19th birthday, on November 24, 1990 as part of a trio called Los Metallicos with older brother Plata and non-relative Platino, who was later replaced by Bronce on the trio before Plata and Platino and Bronce became the trio when Oro started being pushed as a single. He and Plata captured the Mexican tag team titles on December 4, 1991 in Acapulco before losing them back on December 17, 1991 at the same Arena Coliseo. He was a big hit in his Japanese debut for the Universal promotion in April 1992 with his spectacular flying moves, and was scheduled for his next tour as part of the debut of Full in mid-December. His hardcore reputation in Japan was such that a few months back when he teamed up in Mexico City with Mil Mascaras and Ultimo Dragon, the magazines billed it as a team of the best flyer of the 70s, 80s and 90s. He was given his first World Singles Championship on May 23, 1993 when he defeated Mano Negra for the NWA middleweight title in Guadalajara, but lost the title back on June 15 in Puebla to Negra.